Hi, and welcome to Fair Perspectives, the official podcast of the ProHuman movement, brought to you by the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I'm your host, Angeleduardo, and I'll be flying solo today as my co-host melissachen is away. Our guest today is Greg Thomas. Greg is a writer, teacher, entrepreneur, and CEO of the Jazz Leadership Project, which uses a creative methodology to frame leadership and team development through the lens of jazz. Greg has written about culture, race, and democratic life in publications ranging from The Village Voice, Integral Life, New Republic, Salon, UPTOWN, The Root, The Guardian Observer, and the New York Daily News as a jazz columnist. We discuss jazz and its ability to serve as a foundation for learning, leadership, and connection, the power and importance of art and storytelling in our culture, race and the idea of transcending race in our society and personal lives, Greg's use of the term Black American and the tensions of trying to adopt it without racialization. We talk about whether American is an ethnicity, how to disentangle culture and ethnicity from race, and much, much more. Ladies and gentlemen, Greg Thomas. Greg Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on Fair Perspectives here.
Thank you, Angel. Glad to join you.
So you and I have chatted a lot. We've actually run into each other a bunch of times. And you have been schooling me actually on jazz because I am a musician, but I'm very illiterate when it comes to jazz. I told you that to me, jazz is kind of like poetry. I'm also a writer, so I analogize it this way, that it's like poetry in that the good stuff is really, 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 really good, life-changingly good, but the vast majority of it is awful. And so it's very hard to tell if you don't know what you're getting into. So I've enlisted you as my guide into the world of jazz.
Well, I'm happy to do it, and I look at it as a good teacherly responsibility because you're very open and very thoughtful, and the fact that you asked me to do that. They say when the student is ready, the teacher will come. So in terms of this, I'm happy to do it. I would say that a lot of music, not just jazz, ultimately is played by people who are either average, mediocre, that's kind of the distribution anyway. You're only going to have a certain number at the true upper tier of mastery, That's just the way it is. So
that's true.
We're focusing on the masters, and hopefully in our conversation today, there'll be some other masters who we'll refer to in other domains.
Yeah, beautifully put. I think you're right in that, all genres of any art, I guess, you've got the cream of the crop and then the rest. I think it's probably harder, in my view, to be among the cream of the crop in jazz. And that's what I mean, is that it's a more difficult thing to be amazing at. Whereas, a rock musician, if you've got the sensibility, you can know 3 chords and you can write amazing stuff and not be technically proficient in any real way. But jazz, I feel like the bar is higher there.
Well, it is, because the legacy of the music over the last 100 years, you've got these grand masters and giants, who you're following. So that's one of the reasons it's difficult. But to be able to play jazz, if you can improvise, it's just a question of, your own voice, how well you improvise, how well you play with others, and go through that usual process of, beginner, intermediate, advanced, or what's the apprentice, journeyman, master craftsman. It's really a question of that. You find that there's a lot of journeymen out here.
Yeah.
But even journeyman jazz musicians, to be able to improvise and to be able to adapt themselves to the art form, puts them a leg above those who can just play 3 chords usually.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. And not that there's anything wrong with 3 chords. I mean, most of the Beatles songs, that's 3 chords, maybe 4, with 1 weird chord they throw in there that they just learned, and it's incredible, timeless music. So I know you're not saying that.
No, not at all. I mean, the blues is based on the 1-4-5 progression.
That's right.
That's 3 chords.
Solid.
You know,
Yeah, solid.
It's foundation.
Yeah, exactly. So this may seem tangential to those who are listening right now or watching, but it's not at all, because jazz is such a significant part of your life, and you also use jazz in a very powerful way beyond the scope of mere, teaching of music itself. So tell us a little bit about your relationship to jazz and the Jazz Leadership Project and what that's all about.
I'd be glad to. Thank you so much. Well, the Jazz Leadership Project is an enterprise that I run with my co-founder and partner, Jewel Kins Thomas, who's my partner in life too. And we launched JLP about 6 years ago to use the principles and practices of jazz music for leadership development and team development. We find that it is a powerful metaphor and analogy for the development of oneself in terms of your own skills and capacities, but also oneself in collaboration and cohesion with others. And so we have built a company that we've been very fortunate to build relationships and have a client list that includes some very top tier companies, from JP Morgan Chase to Verizon, TD Bank, and more, including Google, who we're actually coaching numerous individual leaders, doing multiple sessions with them. And it's been a joy and pleasure to apply these creative musical principles as a cultural technology to help individuals better see within themselves in terms of what they do, but how that connects to others through Big Ears, which is our principle of deep listening, and there's other principles that we could talk about. But I think that's a decent overview to start.
It's such a great idea. But I play music, and so I'm kind of already bought into the concept, right? So how do you explain this to someone who according to them has no musical ability, no musical proclivity, have never touched an instrument? Maybe they enjoy music, but that's the extent of it. Well, how do you even broach this? How does it work? How do you introduce them to it?
Well, we usually, let's say we're on a Zoom call. We usually have a basic 20-minute presentation that we do, where we use some slides, where we talk about the 4 principles and the 6 practices. We play a little music so they can hear it and feel it. And then we do this both in our workshops, our long-term engagements, and for initial pitches. We bridge the music and the ideas from the music and the practices of the music to the workplace. So we're always making that bridge, and usually people, they're like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. Now, I'll be honest with you, there have been some cases where people just don't get it. I remember talking to an accountant, and he was just scratching his head because he just couldn't get it. So not everybody will get it,
Right.
But but I find that people, once they take the time to hear the music, and then start to make those connections that we're spelling out, that they're usually intrigued enough to search, a little further. And then once we engage with them, I tell you, it's a very powerful, as I say, cultural technology.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's just so, really, there's a great saying, I forget who said it, but I heard it somewhere, which is, it's basically, how you do anything is how you do everything. And that principle resonates so much with me as someone who does art in all these different mediums. People always ask me, oh, you do photography, you do music, you do writing. What's the difference? How do you approach those things? What's the difference in your approach or in your craft for these things? And I always say that there is no difference. I approach them the exact same way. It doesn't feel any different. It's just a different, it goes out a different pipe, but it's
a different medium.
Yeah, it's sometimes something is better as a story rather than a song,
Right.
and vice versa. Sometimes it's better as just a photograph. Sometimes it's a short film or something. Right. But it's really all storytelling and finding connections and making analogies and kind of connecting to and relating the human experience. That's what it all is. And so I totally see the way that you're bridging the way that jazz works, the culture of jazz, the sort of interplay and the deep listening and the improvisation and the connectivity that jazz facilitates or necessitates, and something like working together in an office. It seems totally disconnected, but really there's a fundamental human interaction going on and the principles are the same.
It's interesting because there's so many thoughts that came to my mind as you were saying that. And one is that the arts are so fundamental to human experience.
Yeah.
Fundamental, dance, music, visual arts. And it goes way, way back. So, it has something to do with how I think our cognitive capacities and our cultural capacities developed, so that when people really have a powerful artistic experience, and even a transformative artistic experience, it is something that, it deals with rhetoric. Okay. So I wrote a piece in which I connected jazz. There's a book called Civic Jazz that I wrote a review of, basically. And it's based on the work of Kenneth Burke, who within the field of communications is iconic, communications and rhetoric. And his notion of rhetoric was different than Aristotle's. It wasn't just about persuasion per se. For him, rhetoric had to do with the interaction between the artifact or the form, the art form, and the person engaging with the form. And it's that relationship that gives a basis for communication and a rhetorical way of looking at how we do what we do. So I think that's a bridge. That rhetorical view is a bridge between the arts and other aspects of what we do as human beings, because ultimately, it's communication, even if it's just ourselves. Right. It's like, sometimes it's internal communication. So it's a stream of consciousness in our mind. There's some type of narrative flow or pattern. And so that's how those connections you're talking about. That's why so many artists do more than one art. Ralph Ellison was one of my icons. He was one of the greatest essayists and fiction writers of the 20th century in America. He was also a photographer. Right. He also put together stereo components. So you use your
wow.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. You use your creativity, and it's expressed through different mediums, but it's really a powerful example of the creative process. The creative process is now that's you're talking fundamental to human beings. The creative process is what's fundamental,
The improvisation of adaptability, of adaptation itself. Like figuring out how to pick up a rock and go, I can use this to break something.
Right.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Now you're going back to the early parts of our, human existence, where he talked about tool making and how the tools we created then allow us to expand what we did as human beings. And then there's a building and a building upon that until you get to, contemporary time.
Yeah. So you and I talking through a computer screen that we couldn't build it if we tried, right? we use this stuff, we have it in our pockets, but we couldn't figure this out. So everything's been outsourced. That's how much there is.
That's right.
It's an amazing concept. And you're right. I'm not surprised. I didn't know that about Ellison, but I'm not surprised, because the most brilliant minds in human history, I read a book on Da Vinci. I read a biography on Da Vinci. That guy must have been if not the single greatest genius that's ever lived. He's got to be one of them. He's got to be in
There's
the
no
top
question.
three.
Oh no,
because
there's
the
no
guy,
question. Right?
if it weren't for his inability to complete things, he'd be known as the most brilliant human being that's ever lived, because he pioneered dentistry and anatomy studies and 3D modeling of shapes and geometry. He did all this stuff in his notebooks and just never finished it. But it's all in there, and it's insane, the stuff that he predicted, the stuff that he anticipated. He predated Newton's theories of gravity and stuff just by reasoning and analogizing, studying water so that he could paint it accurately,
right.
Studying rock formation so that he could paint them accurately. He would go down these rabbit holes of curiosity and end up discovering like scientific facts and revolutionary scientific thinking just for the sake of his art. At least that was the impetus. It's
I hear
amazing.
you. And look how through that person, through Da Vinci, how art and science are melded together. So, I mean, it used to be where so many of these disciplines were really together under the rubric of philosophy. And then, it got broken up into these different fields and disciplines. And now everything is so segregated. But what you're talking about, I think, is the kind of sensibility that allows us to reintegrate a more integral perspective, where we integrate. Yeah, the distinctions are there, but we've got to find ways to synthesize these different domains so that, we can get out of some of the crises that we're in. I mean, there's some wicked problems we're dealing with, and we need the kind of thinking, the kind of foresight, the kind of integration of feeling and form to riff on Suzanne Langer, a great American philosopher, so that we can address these problems in a way where, we can attempt to see the whole or envision the whole, so that we don't just, so it's approaching wisdom. So we don't just do this over here and this problem pops up over there because you haven't seen the whole picture,
Right. Yeah. And it's amazing that we're sort of teasing this theme out, because so much of what we're here to talk about is connected to all of this. That you mentioned, I always was frustrated by the idea that history is over here, English is over here, science is over here, and never the twain shall meet. It seems to me that you need science to understand history. You need history to understand science. You need the narrative. I talk about this all the time, but the reason why people can tell you, they can sit you down and talk to you for hours about the lore and the history of the characters and houses and events from Game of Thrones or Star Wars, like the extended universe of Star Wars, an entire galaxy's worth of content and characters and histories and interactions and, battles and scenes and all these things. But they couldn't tell you, what year certain documents got signed, or they couldn't tell you, what's going on in American history in 15 whatever, that sort of stuff. They can't tell you, and because they've put history into this box in their head. That's the boring stuff that I sit through in school.
Right.
But then when I go home, I watch TV and I learn all about Game of Thrones, which is based on European history, right? It's like, but it's the difference is the power of narrative, the power of storytelling, and the way that it's presented to you. If it were presented to you in this powerful narrative way that resonates with us as humans, because we are a storytelling species, then it would be different. So it's about
totally agree, man. I totally agree. And part of that is why myth is so important. People think of myth, oftentimes as, that's something that's not true. Well, if you look at the course of human development, you could say that, there was a period where myth was so powerful. But as we develop and go through different stages of development as humans, you don't just give up the previous stages. You know what I mean? So, people talk about postmodernism. And one of the issues with postmodernism is that in its critique of modernity, there's not an appreciate or enough of appreciation and acceptance of some of the findings from modernity, like science. You got, science is fundamental, to what we look at as truth. But before that, you had, of course, you had religion, but myth, the power and function of myth. Now, I didn't mean to necessarily riff on Joseph Campbell, but it fits, the power of myth is so, because of, like you said, story, narrative, and then that connects to meaning, which is why, that's part of my focus on culture, man. Values and meanings as, through narrative, that's one way of doing it. Then values and meaning through different art forms, where art is separate, art is separate from your everyday life. It is part of your everyday life, yes, but it's separate. It's like Ellison would say that, art has a frame around it. So it's what Albert Murray would say is that art is a reenactment of something from life in a different way, in a different form. So we need that kind of separation so we can kind of reflect and look at aspects of ourselves in a deeper way. That's the same thing with story and myth. It's like, once upon a time. Once you say that, people are in a mode where they're ready to go through a journey.
Yeah, it's a context.
Yeah.
Right. And certain rules don't apply, and certain freedoms must be allowed in order for that exploration to happen. It's a fenced in sort of playground, right? Where within these walls, something amazing can happen. And you can't necessarily apply that to your everyday, get up, go commute, go to work, come back thing. But we need to be able to visit that place. I'm thinking of like a theater. You walk into a movie theater, you're going to sit down and just experience something, and it's not going to make any sense. And you're going to have to suspend your disbelief. You're going to have to do a lot of those things in order to have that experience.
Absolutely. And that's why the word play. Yeah. You go to see a play. You play music. The concept of play is just so fundamental, again, to our human existence. I mean,
and it's funny that all the most coveted professions are ones in which we use that term. You want to be an actor so you can play roles, and you want to be a rock star so you can play music, and you want to be an athlete so you can play sports.
Right.
And it's all we want to do is play, right? But it doesn't have this sort of diminutive quality that we often attribute to it. Right? It's like beautiful,
it's like
powerful.
Once you become an adult, play. Now, let me give you a quick example. It's so funny. I'm sitting with my daughter, who is now an adult in graduate school at MIT. But when she was like 5 or 6 years old, she's sitting on my lap and we're watching a cartoon. And she's laughing and I'm laughing, but I'm an adult. So I ended up saying, I said, oh man, this is so silly. She looked at me and said, Daddy, it's supposed to be silly. And I'm like, oh, you're right, baby. You are so right. It's that attitude of play, and that ties to, the comedic dimension and humor and why that's so important. Ellison would talk about the blues and America and American literature as being tragicomic. So the tragic dimension is there, but that comic dimension, it's like going back to the ancient Greek masks, where you see one mask, the other mask with the smile. That's that tragic comic, and you need an awareness of both. If you just have the tragic, oh man, you end up as like, do I continue going on or do I end it all? But you can't just have the comic either, because the comedic dimension or the comic dimension where, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy and girl get back together. Yay! That's kind of the comic tradition. And that's beautiful. But that's not all of life. The tragic is there too. So you kind of have both of those going at the same time. Boy, I didn't realize our conversation was going to go in this direction. It's so cool, man.
Yeah, no, me neither. Me neither. But it actually still all ties together, because the next thing I was going to ask you about was, I think you and I both saw Wynton Marsalis on Bill Maher, and he had this beautiful thing that he said when Bill Maher asked him about race. And, he said, but we're all just playing jazz, and we need to recognize one another in that sort of tradition, right? So it ties back to all the stuff that we've been talking about. I'm sure you saw that.
Oh, I did see.
What did you think? And
yeah, and I would agree with Wynton. I mean, I happen to know Wynton. I've known Wynton since 1993, and
I was 8 years old, just so you know.
Okay. And Wynton and I come out of a similar lineage, a similar intellectual and philosophical lineage. I've mentioned Ralph Ellison. I've mentioned Albert Murray. I call them together the Ralph Ellison, Albert Murray continuum of thought, which focuses on more about culture, more about art, more about a philosophical way of seeing our lives as individuals and as citizens in the United States, for example, but even beyond. So, I totally got that and get it and agree with Wynton. Yeah. I mean, he and I have talked quite a bit over the years. And Wynton is always, Wynton, he'll acknowledge, he's like, look, when I grew up, he went through all kind of stuff growing up in Kenner, Louisiana. That's, I guess not far from New Orleans. And he experienced racism. So he's not going to deny, as I'm not going to deny, as you're not going to deny, that racism still exists. But when it comes to race, where you separate human beings into subspecies, as if there are this hard and fast, immutable differences among those human beings based on their skin color, the shape of their head, the size of the nose.
Yeah. It's
ludicrous. It's a ludicrous notion,
Yeah.
But people, you have a history of 300-400 years where this racial worldview and this process of racialization, which is how races are created, came into existence, where today, people, on the media, every single day, in every what do you call I'm trying to think of the technical term that they use for audiences in different regions, but no matter where
demographics.
Well, that's one thing. Well, they look at demographics, and race is one of them. But anyway, on network TV, cable TV, especially news, every day you're going to see something about, where they talk about Black people and white people. And the thing is, those things in terms of race are fallacious. Biological race is a fallacy. As human beings, we share 99% or something of the same genetic, underpinnings.
Yep.
And you have certain little differences that will determine your color of your skin, for example. But that says nothing about your internal values, your subjective thoughts, your education, your interests, your talents and abilities, your experience. Now, of course, because people believe in race and behave based on that belief and that process of racialization, there's differential treatment and double standards that are based on that has impact on people's life chances. That's real, no question.
Yeah.
But as you well know, me and others like Carlos Hoyt and Sheena Mason, we did a conference, a one-day conference, September 24th of 2022 in Lexington, Massachusetts, that I'm happy to say you attended, Resolving the Racism Dilemma, where we're trying to pull the rug from under this process of racialization that keeps this stuff together. this racial world, seeing the world through the lens of race, where it's like a racial world and you're a racial agent in that world. Ay, ay, ay. I mean,
Yeah. We're definitely engaged in the same project there. And I think that one of our major challenges is something that you address in a recent piece that you just wrote, where you actually directly disagree with our friends and colleagues, John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, and a couple of other people who kind of, for lack of a better way of framing it, sort of throw their hands up and say, look, this is the water we're swimming in, and I don't know that there's a way to get out of it. And I don't know that we should even want to necessarily, right? Depending on what we're talking about. So tell us a little bit about that and what prompted that, what thoughts from Glenn and John prompted that, and what your responses are.
Thank you. You're talking about the piece entitled Considering De-Racialization, a response to Glenn Lowry and Clifton Roscoe, who's a friend of Glenn Lowry's, who had a piece on his Substack titled something like "Race is Here to Stay." We just need to learn how to deal with it. So I took umbrage at that and disagreed with that respectfully. Okay.
Sure.
I have deep respect for Glenn Lowry and his integrity, and he's gone through various stages in his own life. And as he's writing his biography, is reflecting on those stages. And he's being very self-critical. It's like sometimes, there's a lot of people who might criticize the period in the 80s when he was, pro-Reagan and stuff. But people, they go through developmental changes. And he's probably more harsh on himself than those people, But I think that what I found as far as Glenn in particular is that he says, yes, we need to stop over racializing various topics, because that's a dangerous road to go down. We've seen that. He says, but as far as like de-racializing, where we, really separate ourselves from race per se, he said, I don't know about that because I have these traditions, these Black American or African American, Afro American, whatever term you want to use, that I don't want to let go of. I've been nurtured by them. And what I said in the piece is I'm nurtured by them too. And I have given up believing in the concept of race. And I want to separate myself from the process of racialization. And I no longer believe in a racial worldview. That doesn't mean that I give up my heritage, my ancestry, my culture. It doesn't mean that. And I think what happened there is that I think Glenn is conflating, in this instance, race and culture, which is a really unfortunate conflation because they are not the same thing. With John McWhorter, John just says, look, I choose my battles. That's not a battle. That's not a battle I'm willing to wage. And that's his prerogative. That's his prerogative.
He's got too many. He's got enough of his own.
Yeah, he's got enough, so I don't begrudge anybody just choosing not to wage that battle that I've chosen to wage. But there are some of us who have chosen to wage that battle because it's so tied to our identity as Americans, and then to continue from Americans as a part of, our Western heritage. And it's been so destructive. Now, if we deracialize tomorrow, particularly in the piece you're talking about, we talk about the U.S. Census and where we add racialization, or should we say how you are racialized, to the question about race. So instead of compelling people to self-racialize, what race are you? Which assumes that race is a reality. You would say or ask, how are you racialized? Because how you are treated is often related to and connected to how you're racialized.
Yeah.
So that question allows you to, like we were talking about with art, separate yourself from race and racialization but you can acknowledge that people are racialized and still track bias and discrimination by tracking how people are racialized. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. So you're talking about Carlos Hoyt's sort of change.org petition to amend the 2030 census
exactly.
to include this sort of
specifying. That's exactly what I'm talking.
And we're gonna have Carlos on the podcast, so I'm gonna grill him on that.
Great.
So I won't waste my questions on you there.
Okay, good.
But I do have some concerns that will actually come out in my questions to you about your specific approach, because
I would say this.
We talked.
Can I say this? Excuse me for interrupting you.
Yeah. But
it was wonderful at the conference. You were like, I love being the confounding variable. So and you were like, I don't fit any of those boxes. But at the top of the revamped form, the sample form, the first box is basically, I do not identify with race.
Yeah.
So that option is there too.
Yeah, that's huge for sure. Yeah. And that's what I would put. And it just gets complicated because now you're talking about perceptions and whether you know people's perceptions. So one of the things that I said during that conference was some people insist that I am Black because I'm Dominican. My parents are from the Dominican Republic. That's Hispaniola. That is, 90% of the people on that island are of African ancestry. So I'm Black. But other people insist that I am white because I've written certain essays and things. And also, some people insist, no, you are mixed. You are of mixed ancestry. And then you have to wonder what that means and what the percentage is, 60-40, 70-30, like what is it? And it just gets way too confusing. But yeah, like I said, I'm looking forward to grilling Carlos on this because it's a really fascinating conversation to have. But with you, I think the thing that I want to grill you on. So yeah, I wanted to grill you about something related to this kind of the way you're seen and the way you see yourself and the way we label one another and ourselves. And so a while back we did a podcast with Thomas Chatterton Williams and I brought you up and I basically broke down. Yeah. So, and I know you saw that because you reached out and said, I feel like you got me wrong. Yeah. So let me break down what I was thinking there. Okay. So you use the term Black American, capital B, capital A, as a kind of ethnicity for, I guess, Africans descended from slaves, right? African Americans, right, who are descended from slaves, and as a particular sub ethnicity within the ethnicity of American. And
I don't think American is an ethnicity. I think American is a nationality.
Okay, so we'll talk about
this. In
other
words, it's a national. I would say that if you look at American culture overall, you could say that the people we're referring to, because there have been many names, colored.
Yeah.
American Negroes, Negro Americans, They're a group of people who have created a culture that within the American context is a subculture. In other words, it's a idiomatic variation that you can point to historically where various forms were created, the spirituals, the blues, jazz, that there were certain cultural styles and approaches to the way we speak and improvise in speech, dance, culinary stuff, so that's more what I'm referring to. Gotcha. I want to let you, I can continue, but I really want to let you get out more of what you mean so I can clarify that. And so the audience also can hear more of what your either critique or your questions are that, for clarification.
Yeah. Well, you've actually already answered one point of confusion, and we can talk more about this, which is that I feel that American is an ethnicity.
Okay.
and it's a unique one. It's a complicated one because of the nature of America itself as a melting pot sort of place, right? There's a way in which, people come as immigrants and they are Italian or French or Irish, and then their children are Irish American or French American or Italian American, and then their children are maybe still Italian American, maybe still French American, but eventually, 2-3 generations down, they're just American now. And of course, they are of that particular ancestry. They have certain cultural norms and ways of being that are indicative of or informed by that ancestry, right? But even that starts to get muddy because, you have New Jersey Italians and you have Brooklyn Italians, and they're not that far away from each other, but there's a distinct difference. And then, you have Italians in Chicago, and that's also a distinctly different thing. The ancestry is the same or similar, but it has varied now in this beautiful way. And so it becomes difficult to see all of those people as belonging to one group. It seems more sensible to me to break them up into their own sort of regional groups and then subdividing it from even within that, because even, different neighborhoods in Chicago will have a different kind of culture and a way of being. As a New Yorker, and you also live nearby, Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, those are different. And the vibe is different. The way people talk is different. And then even within that, right, the Polish community in Brooklyn versus the Dominican or Puerto Rican community in Brooklyn versus the Italian community in Brooklyn, it's different.
Yep.
There are differences, right? So I see the same thing going on with what we're calling Black Americans, right? There's the Black Americans in West Virginia, and then Chicago, and then New York City, and then Los Angeles, and so I have two points of contention here. The first is just the use of the racialized term, because as we've been discussing, right, there's a kind of pernicious way. There's a pernicious sort of magnetism to those terms and the concepts that have been tied to them that is really hard to escape. Maybe magnetism is the wrong. It's a gravity, right? We're kind of perilously orbiting this thing and hoping that we're not just going to get sucked into it. But the danger to me is still there. So that's the first one. The second one is the risk of kind of globbing together these groups that don't really belong together in this larger American experiment where the diversity and the variation is sort of the point. And it becomes this thing we call American that is super multifaceted in the way that, Japanese is not, or Italian is not, even though there are, of course, subcultures and subgroups within both of those paradigms. They're not the same. They're not subgroups and subcultures in the same way, just by dint of the way our history is played out. So I put a lot on the table there, but let me know what you think.
Thank you. Well, first, I would say I would be willing to entertain the idea that American is an ethnicity. That's a point that my colleague, Dr. Sheena Mason, who's been a guest on your show and who also, like me, is an advisor to FAIR. So I'm definitely willing to entertain that. I mean, we know that even the concept of ethnicity is somewhat muddy, So, we try to come up with these defined ways of describing human dynamics and different groups of people in different places at different times. So what I would say specifically with Black is, let me tell you kind of the origins of my use of that term. As you know, it's very rare for me in my writing or speech to say Black without the qualifier of American. Okay? So you're right. Black American to me is an ethnocultural term within the context of America, okay? Because American is a nationality. My parents' generation from the 60s, unlike previous generations, they embraced the word Black. Because previous to that, it was like, you know, those were fighting words often. If you called somebody Black, it was, you know.
Right.
So they were like, wait a second. I'll give you an example. There's a book on marketing. I'm trying to remember I think it's called Positioning. And the authors, they talk about how from a marketing perspective, the folks in the 60s who claimed that Black is beautiful, it was like a brilliant marketing strategy. It flipped the script on the negativity of the connotation of the word previously. So for one thing, because my parents' generation embraced it, I continue that practice. That's one thing. Another is that I think if you look at the work of Stuart Hall, who was a very important scholar and writer and an intellectual out of Britain and the British cultural studies movement. He did a series of lectures at Harvard in the 90s, but they came out in the 2000s. And he talks about how even if we separate ourselves from race, there's always going to be some trace of it left because it's been so entrenched that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to erase it. So say you have a blank sheet of paper. You know the word palimpsest? So you've got a piece of paper and you have writing on it. And then you erase that writing. Well, traces of what was there is still there, you know? So I admit that there's some traces of the racialized version of Black when I say Black American. I don't deny it, you know? I try to clearly define it for myself and for others on what I mean. Now, you can also say Afro-American, okay? I've been using that term a little more of late.
I noticed that.
I've been using that.
And I was like, yes, yes, Greg.
But I don't use African American. I'm not disputing with those who decide to use it. But with me, I don't use African American because I think that should be reserved for Africans, contemporary Africans who come to America. And that can include more than just people who are racialized as Black. Because they're not just Black people, so-called, on the African continent.
Elon Musk. We could put him in the African American.
Right.
And Charlize Theron, right?
Yeah.
No one is going to like that.
I know.
No one's going to like that.
I know. But, you know.
But you know what? Let me stop you there just because. So one thing that is distinct about, you know, African descendants of slaves is that their ancestry is difficult or impossible to trace beyond a certain point, right? And it just struck me right now that, you know, wanting to reserve African American for those from Africa who come to the US, we want to call them African Americans. Why aren't we calling them Nigerian American or Ghanaian American or South African American, you know, for example? And the reason why, you know, the ADOS would be called African American is because we can't go further than that. And so it becomes its own sort of delineation. What do you think about that? Have you thought about that at all?
That's interesting. I mean, I certainly think that one of the things I like about the way you laid out the differentiations among people in different areas and regions, even if they have the same ancestry, is that it's a more realistic view of human beings and the cultural and social environment that they're actually in.
Right.
And so I like that. It's like I apply the same kind of thought that you stated for Africans, Nigeria, Ghanaian, Congolese, and other places to folks from the Caribbean. My wife is from Barbados. There are folks from Jamaica, and that's a distinct heritage and history.
Yeah.
They're all a part of, they have a same Caribbean, overall location, but there's distinctions among them. And I think it's really important to keep the distinctions, or at least to acknowledge them, the distinctions, be aware of them, because again, it's a more realistic view of our human reality and our human experience. But I think this is where the ideas of America are so powerful. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Diversity within unity, a unified diversity. So those differences are there, and we don't want to erase those differences. Let's just likely say, variety is the spice of life. Those differences are good and cool if we look at it and treat it in the right way. If we don't set up some type of specious hierarchy of, based on skin color. I mean, those differences can be beautiful, and those differences can be, to me, see, I'm a New Yorker. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My family's from the South, but I was born
there you go.
So growing up, it was so great to be around Irish folks and Jewish folks and Polish folks and, Italians and this and that. And it was so, and so I'm used to that kind of variety and differentiation. There are certain people in the United States, if they stay more local and the folks that they're around are mostly the same in terms of how they've been racialized, then their experience might not be as broad or cosmopolitan as that, But I mean, that's how I came up. So, when you talk about all those, varieties, So, but the thing is, now let's talk about another aspect of this that we have to acknowledge. Now, you said descendants of slaves. Okay. So in this country, yes, descendants of slaves who have created culture and cultural styles, cultural idioms, cultural forms within and through which they express their highest values and meanings. And this is one thing that is interesting. There was a great interview with Ellison, I think it's from 1958, called Some Questions, Some Answers. And the interviewer asked him, well, what would you think of the term Black culture? He says, whether it's white culture or Black culture, I think that's racist. He said this in 1958.
Yeah.
Okay? He says, look, if you look at Haitians, people from Haiti, they have more of a Catholic upbringing. There's differences. Just because they have similar skin tones and we're closer to, their African heritage than others who, because, I mean, all of humanity came from Africa, okay? We're talking about,
that's the other thing.
We're talking about more recent, So he said, what we share, talking about what we as what he called Negro Americans or American Negroes share with folks in the Caribbean and folks in Africa and other places that were colonized. We share a hatred for the oppression and for the dehumanization that came from enslavement and colonization. So that's a shared political identification. He says, but its cultural value is almost nil.
Right.
So there's shared political. So when you talk about politics, you're talking about power, and you're talking about, resources, and you're talking about, ways of engaging in the pluralistic conflict, and competition over resources. There are shared identifications we have because of that shared experience. that doesn't mean we have the same culture. And you are right. And I really like what you say, because I have an article called Jazz versus Racism. And I talk about how when I was in college, I went to Hamilton College from 1981 to 1985. And
I was born in 85, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. I mean, you're not trying to imply anything about my age, are you?
No, just making some notes.
It's just facts, right?
It's just facts, exactly.
And in 1977, I watched Roots. I talk about in this article how, it was really with Roots that so many folks, and myself included, became aware by seeing that visual, those images and that storyline, the horrors of the slave trade, losing your traditional names, being forced to adopt another name, being whipped and brutalized, if you run away, being caught and being enchained and sold and separated from your family, all of that stuff, that planted a seed, which in college, when I started going deeper into the history, started bubbling up as almost a hatred for people, as I would now say, who are racialized as white. But what prevented me from going down that rabbit hole of hate was the music, was my love for jazz and immersing myself in jazz when I was in high school, where I didn't segregate who I listened to and liked based on race.
Right.
It was a sound. It was a style that I loved. So yes, Black Americans, Afro-Americans, Negro Americans, colored Americans, whatever you want to say, created the blues and created jazz. But as I love to say, when an art form is created, it becomes a gift to the world. So it's not that Black people, Black Americans own jazz. You've got to ask me permission before you can play it. That's ridiculous. People, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, people say that though.
Yes,
you're taking. Eminem doesn't count. Eminem is stealing.
Eminem is an American who fell in love with an art form created by Black folk, and I like to say white folk and Black folk because that's a Southern way of putting a more human face on it. You say Black folk, white folk.
Right.
He fell in love with that art form. He devoted himself to that art form, as did people like Bix Beiderbecke in jazz, Stan Getz, Paul Desmond, Phil Woods. These are people who are racialized as white, whose music I fell in love with. To bring it from a little further up to date, the late, great Michael Brecker. There's a guy still alive on the West Coast named Pete Chrisley. I love their playing. And what I did for this article, man, was I said, let me do a little more research into their ancestry. And I found out that Phil Woods was a combination of I think French, German, and Irish. And that one of them had Southern heritage and another one had a different mixture. And it gave me a richer understanding of who they were.
Right.
Other than saying white. So one of the things I say in the piece, I said, isn't it a shame that through the term white, that their background, the differences in their background and the individuality of their background is erased. Like you take some white out and just white out that.
Yep.
It's
literally white.
literally whiting it out.
Yeah.
So that's why I say I like the way you're saying that we have to look at where people come from, their regional identities and cultural or environmental influences too. Because as I said to Sheena, when I was on Sheena Mason's own podcast, I said, look, people who are racialized as Black, who are from the South originally, and those who are from the North, and those who are from the West Coast, and those from the Midwest, there are differences among them. They have a shared history in terms of this country, and there are some shared dynamics that you can call Black American culture. But check this out. And this is the beauty of culture over race. Black American culture is not just, when you look at its tributaries, Black. As Americans,
yeah, for sure,
Europe is a part of our heritage. So Black Americans have, in part, a European heritage, in part, an African heritage, in part, aspects from the Caribbean, and in jazz, an Afro-Cuban element. The great pianist and composer Jelly Roll Morton, he called it the Spanish tinge. That's in the music. And it's in our culture.
Yeah.
So, if we dig deeper than these ridiculous, immutable labels based on skin color, we find such richness that we can focus on. But again, it's a diversity within the unity. The unity are American ideals founded and grounded in the nation's founding documents, what Ellington called our sacred documents. So that ties into the concept of like a secular religion in terms of America. And I'm not talking about jingoistic patriotism. I'm talking about an appreciation for the ideals of this nation that are found in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, particularly the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And I extend it to the Emancipation Proclamation, to Lincoln's second inaugural address. I mean, these are where in script, in writing, in narration, are ideals that become beacons for us to aspire to and to work towards. And this is something that Stanley Crouch, my late friend, who's a part of this lineage that I say that Winton and I share, he would talk about how the amendment process, that the fact that we can bring amendments to bear, has within it a way for us to address and redress past wrongs. So this is something that's inherent in our political philosophy. And so it's really important for us to recognize those ideals and recognize how we violate them, have violated them, and do violate them all the time. That doesn't mean we throw them away. That doesn't mean we say they're full of crap. No. You still use it as inspiration and work towards it together with other people. And that's an omni-American, to use another term that I like to use. That's an omni-American perspective. That's a term from Albert Murray in the title of his first book, The Omni-Americans.
Yeah, I have it up on my shelf here somewhere.
Cool.
I haven't gotten through it yet.
Okay.
It's a little dry for me, but I'm trying.
Well, the thing is, I would say that particular book, there are aspects of it that are time, that are based on the time. He came out in 1970, in the midst of the movement or right after, like a couple of years after Dr. King and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. So there are certain things that are time bound, but there are certain things that are timeless there too. And that's true for his book, The Hero and the Blues also. So I would recommend that. Stomping the Blues too, on the music. So, But the thing is, as with jazz, I'm here for you, man. If you want to talk about that.
For sure. Yeah, man. Oh, no, I'm going to be pestering you for a long time. There's too much to learn from you, man.
I appreciate that.
But yeah, I love everything you're saying. And I love the idea of, you mentioned Stanley Crouch and you mentioned Wynton Marsalis as being with you in this sort of intellectual ancestry.
Yeah.
Exactly. You guys have an intellectual, philosophical ancestry. I love that.
I call it the blues idiom wisdom tradition. And I point to Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman as the mother and father of that tradition.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. And
so see, and it's connected to thought. It's connected to a way of being, right? And, I grew up sort of by osmosis, sort of just understanding, Elvis Presley, for example, stole Black music, right? Like he got famous because of racism, and that was the only vehicle from which the dominant culture would accept that sort of music, right? That was my conception of it, and there's some truth to that, but I think I heap too much blame on himself, right? And I recently, rather than watch the film that just came out, I decided to watch an HBO documentary called The Seeker about him. It's a two-parter, and it's really well done. And I've never really been into Elvis. I never got into it. He's got a ton of great songs, but I've just never happened to me. But I love that the reality is he grew up in this culture. He grew up listening to this music. He grew up loving this music. That music belonged to him just as much as it belonged to anybody else. And his skin color had nothing to do with it.
Exactly. Now, one of the things that I say in that same piece is that, yes, it is true that there were songs that were written by Black folk who performed by Elvis, or blues tunes performed by the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or by Pat Boone that became hits, so-called crossover hits. That is true.
Right. Yeah.
But Elvis, to focus on Elvis, I think Elvis and Eminem in some ways are synonymous in that they grew up around it. So it's a part of thank you. It's a part of their culture. He loved gospel music. And it only, and this is where the word appropriation comes up. It only becomes appropriation if you don't acknowledge the source and the origins and steal it, claiming that it's your own and that you created it. That's appropriation.
Right.
Now, I'm saying that's real appropriation.
That's right. I would just say that's theft and plagiarism, right? And leave appropriation out of it, because we had a piece on our Substack recently about cultural appropriation, and that there's no real such thing. There's culture, which constantly fluctuates, and people live in and adopt and can participate in because it belongs to all of us. And then there's bad art. and there's you're taking this thing and you're doing a terrible job with it.
Right.
That's bad art.
Right.
Or there's plagiarism and theft, and those are different things.
You're right.
But
I like when you said that. Let's call it what it is. But the thing is, it's so interesting, and this is why, it's one of the reasons among many that in certain circles, Ellison is out of fashion. But he said, look, we've been appropriating each other's, ways.
Exactly.
Forever. He talks about how if you go back to the 19th century, you have, and some of this is connected to the blackface tradition, but you have Black folks who were imitating the dances that they saw in the big house, but they were imitating it in their own style and parodying it almost in a satirical way. And then the folks in the big house saw what they were doing and started to imitate what they were doing.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
So you have these cross influences all the time. And he actually says, we've been appropriating each other's stuff from time immemorial. That's just the way culture works.
That's all it can ever be. Yeah. Nobody's pulling something out of nothing. Everything comes from something that came before it in some way. It's a response, a reaction, an imitation. In my case, I've written many songs just by attempting to figure out how to play a song that I really liked from someone else and not being able to quite, from memory, I'm trying to figure how does that go? And I'll stumble upon something that doesn't sound anything like what I was trying to do. And here we go. I got a new thing. And you wouldn't even necessarily know that I was trying to do that. You wouldn't be able to connect the two pieces.
Right.
But that's where it came from, right? It's just, that's the way it works. Well, Greg, it's been awesome talking to you, man. I don't want to monopolize too much more of your time, but I want to make sure we ask the last question that we ask all our guests here. As you know, as a fair advisor, you know that our focus is to provide what we call a pro-human approach to the issues of our day and all the issues that you and I have been talking about this whole time. What does pro-human mean to you? And how can everyday people adopt that pro-human approach to their goings-on and their dealings with this cultural stuff?
Pro-human, yeah. I would say pro-human means that we are for what we share in common as humans, and we are for the things that make us distinct as human beings, as members of different human groups. So I'll leave with this philosophical concept that comes from Anthony Appiah and has been extended by Danielle Allen, political philosopher at Harvard, rooted cosmopolitanism. For me, pro-human means that you can be rooted in a particular place. You can be rooted in particular heritage, set of traditions, ancestry, but you can be a citizen of the world also at the same time. And if you're talking about cosmos, you can have a cosmic consciousness. You can realize that you're part of a universe, and the fortune of being alive, of having human consciousness, and the blessing of that, to riff on my Christian heritage, is so profound that we should wake up every day with an attitude of gratitude. We should wake up every day being grateful that we can breathe, that we have another day to strive and to work and to play. You know, like a real attitude of appreciation for just living itself. It's what Murray called, affirmation of life itself. And so to me, pro-human means that we're affirming life in our human existence as spiritual beings having a human experience.
Wow, Greg, I think you may have just bumped Nick Gillespie. Because up until just now, I think he had my favorite response to that question. And you have taken the top spot, I think.
Thank you, sir.
That was perfect.
Thank you, man.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Angel. And thank you for the work you do and for the work FAIR does also.
Thank you for listening to Fair Perspectives. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating and review. You can also access exclusive podcast content, such as Q&As and bonus episodes, by visiting us and signing up at fairperspectives.org. For weekly FAIR news and opinion pieces by members of the FAIR community, visit our Substack at fairforall.substack.com and tune into FAIR News Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to join or support the pro-human movement, visit us at fairforall.org/join us. Thanks again, and see you next time.